Pride is one of humanity's oldest sins, but almost no one understands what it truly means in the Bible. In the modern imagination, pride is synonymous with explicit arrogance, people who speak loudly and consider themselves superior. But in the biblical context, pride is something much deeper and more silent. It is the internal movement of removing God from the center and placing the self in his place. It is a fall that begins in the heart long before it appears in actions. In biblical times, pride was seen as the root of all other vices. The Jews believed that when a person rose too high, they inevitably lost their sense of reality. The Hebrew word for pride conveys the idea of someone who grows beyond their natural limits, like something that inflates until it bursts. This already reveals a crucial point. Pride is not simply a bad feeling, but a spiritual rupture. It separates the human being from their own truth. And that's the most dangerous part. Pride is invisible. People rarely realize they are being governed by it. In ancient texts, the proud person wasn't seen as someone conceited, but as someone disconnected from their own essence, believing they can sustain everything alone. It was the opposite of humility, which didn't mean weakness, but spiritual clarity. The proud person loses the ability to see limits, and therefore stumbles where they don't need to. In the modern world, pride has taken on new forms. It appears in exaggerated self-sufficiency, the need to be right all the time, the difficulty in listening to advice, or the inability to ask for help. In a time when everyone positions themselves as an authority over themselves, pride has become almost a cultural characteristic. But the Bible says that it is destructive because it creates a life built on illusions, and every illusion sooner or later crumbles.
In this video, we will understand pride as the Bible truly presents it, not as a superficial flaw, but as a spiritual distortion that steals purpose, clarity, and inner peace. We will explore its roots in Jewish culture, its impact on Jesus' daily life, and its disguised presence in our lives today. And above all, we will discover the biblical path to neutralize this behavior before it destroys important areas of our lives. This is the first chapter in the series, and perhaps the most crucial.
The most commonly used word in Hebrew for pride is ga'ah. The word proud literally means to rise above what is right. In the biblical context, this described not only arrogant behavior, but also a spiritual movement of self-glorification. For the Jewish people, a proud person was someone who tried to occupy a space that did not belong to them. It was someone who lived beyond their own measure, ignoring limits given by God. Hebrew culture deeply valued balance and awareness of one's own place. An individual who became overly exalted was seen as someone who no longer saw the truth about themselves. In several ancient texts, pride appears as a form of inner blindness. It prevents a person from perceiving reality and recognizing their dependence on the Creator. This distortion was considered dangerous because it preceded bad decisions. The Old Testament repeatedly records that God opposes the proud. This resistance is not vengeance, but a natural consequence. When a human being rises above what is right, he distances himself from divine wisdom. Pride prevents understanding from entering because it closes the heart to instruction. For the Jews, a proud person was isolating himself from everything that could save him from serious errors. Interestingly, many rabbis explained pride as a kind of swelling of the soul. Just as a swollen part of the body loses its proper function, a soul inflated by pride loses its ability to hear, feel, and discern. Therefore, the ancients taught that pride precedes the fall, not as punishment, but because the person loses their good sense and places themselves on dangerous paths. The fall is a consequence, not a punishment. Today, pride manifests itself in much more subtle ways. It appears when we believe we can control everything on our own, when we ignore warning signs, or when we refuse to admit that we need to learn and change. It's the same ancient root, only dressed in modern clothes. And understanding the biblical origin of this behavior helps to realize that it is not just psychological, it's spiritual. And if left untreated, it corrodes decisions, relationships, and destiny. Among ancient Jewish scholars, there was an understanding that pride was the first spiritual distortion to arise in the universe, not as a mythological story, but as a symbolic explanation of the rupture between creature and creator. They interpreted that the fall of the adversary began with the thought, "I will rise above the stars." In other words, the idea of exceeding limits established by God. Pride always begins with a silent exaggeration within the soul. For the rabbis, pride was not simply the desire for power, but the forgetting of one's own purpose. When someone tries to be more than they were called to be, that person inevitably loses themselves. This understanding appears in several reflections from the Second Temple period. They said that the proud person is one who tries to build a life on an inflated identity, ignoring their frailties and spiritual needs. This idea also appears in the scriptures when discussing the fall of humankind in Eden. The problem wasn't just disobedience, but the temptation to be like God. That is, to live without dependence, without limits, and without divine guidance. The fall begins when the self takes the throne. Pride has this effect. It pushes God out of the center and places the ego as the guide, even if the person doesn't consciously realize it. In Jesus' daily life, this type of pride was very present among religious leaders who believed they had total control over the truth. It wasn't theatrical arrogance, but an exaggerated confidence in their own interpretation, leaving no room for correction. Jesus confronted this attitude not to shame them, but to reveal that pride makes a person spiritually deaf. And those who do not listen fall, no matter how religious they may seem. Today, the downfall caused by pride happens in more subtle ways. It appears when we think we don't need help, when we ignore advice, or when we believe we are always right. Pride puts us on risky paths because it makes us believe we are untouchable. And that's exactly where the fall happens. Not as punishment, but because pride disorients. The fall is simply the natural result of walking without clarity. In Jesus' time, pride was not seen merely as open arrogance, but as a type of ostentatious religiosity. Jewish culture at the time was divided into several groups, and among them, the Pharisees were the most learned and disciplined. The problem wasn't their dedication, but the inner feeling of superiority that some cultivated. They believed that their obedience to the law placed them above the common man. It's important to understand that not all Pharisees were hypocrites. Many were sincere and respected. But among religious groups, there was a real tendency towards spiritual pride. They considered their traditions more important than the hearts of the people. Jesus confronted this attitude not because he hated the law, but because he saw pride as a barrier to truth. He could see when pride hid behind rituals and appearances. A little-known fact is that Jesus used parables precisely to break down intellectual arrogance. Those who thought they already knew everything listened to the stories and understood nothing, because arrogance blocks revelation. But the humble, the simple, and the thirsty understood the essence. This shows that the state of the heart determines the depth of spiritual understanding. A mind that is too full cannot receive anything new. Jesus also denounced pride when one group tried to exalt itself at the expense of another. He told parables where the superior ended up ashamed and the humble exalted. These stories were not just moral lessons, they reflected the social and religious structure of the time. Pride created divisions, classified people, and fueled comparisons. It was a silent poison that corroded the community. Today, pride in everyday life doesn't appear in religious garb, but in very similar attitudes. It arises when we compare our choices to those of others as if we were judges, when we think we understand better, live better, or deserve more. Pride infiltrates work, relationships, and even spirituality. Jesus dealt with it daily, and we too need to learn to identify it before it distorts our character. Among the ancient Jews, there was a clear understanding. The worst kind of pride was not the blatant kind, but the silent kind. They called it the inner elevation of the heart, something that no one sees on the outside, but that alters everything on the inside. This invisible pride does not manifest itself with shouts, but with small, overconfident decisions. It was considered the most deadly because it grew unnoticed. And when the person realizes it, they are already far from their own purpose. An interesting historical tidbit is the act of descending as a symbol of humility. The Hebrew word for humble oneself conveys the idea of physically lowering oneself, acknowledging limitations. Therefore, kneeling was a gesture of spiritual clarity, not shame. The proud, on the other hand, had difficulty even bowing down because their minds were always elevated. This contrast between ascending and descending was used to explain internal states of the soul. Jesus also dealt with this hidden pride. He observed when someone performed outward rituals but harbored within themselves a sense of superiority. Therefore, he often confronted thoughts, not just actions. Invisible pride is what makes someone believe they are spiritually well simply because they don't commit major outward failings. But inside, the person is hardened and resistant to God's touch. The most dangerous aspect of this type of arrogance is that it disguises itself as strength. The person convinces themselves that they don't need to listen, learn, adjust, or change. In ancient societies, this was seen as spiritual blindness. An inflated heart loses its sense of touch, fails to perceive warnings, and ignores signs that could save it from greater pain. Ancient sages said that the invisible arrogant person walks smiling towards their own precipice, unaware of the risk. Today, this silent pride manifests itself in modern habits, avoiding asking for help, not admitting mistakes, rejecting advice, or insisting on controlling everything alone. It makes life seem stable until suddenly, everything crumbles. Just as in the biblical world, invisible pride remains the most destructive because it thrives in the dark. And if it is not recognized in time, it steals clarity, wisdom, and balance, precisely the things that sustain a healthy life. In the ancient world, humility did not have the distorted meaning it has acquired today. For the Jews, being humble meant having mental clarity about one's place in life. It wasn't about thinking less of oneself, but about thinking soberly. The Hebrew word for humility carries the idea of someone who lives in alignment with the truth. Therefore, the wise men affirmed that the humble person is strong because they recognize their origin, their limitations, and their dependence on God. An important fact: humility was so valued among Jewish teachers that many of them taught sitting in a lower position than their disciples. This gesture symbolized that no one was above the word itself. They believed that the pursuit of knowledge only flourished in a willing heart. Thus, humility was seen as the fertile ground where wisdom took root. Without it, nothing truly learned. Jesus embodied this vision perfectly. He was neither timid nor withdrawn. He was self-aware. His humility consisted in obeying the Father's plan, even when it seemed to contradict human expectations. Jesus served but also confronted. He was meek, yet profoundly firm. This combination demonstrates that humility is balance, not passivity. It is knowing who you are without needing to prove anything to anyone, and without taking God's place. The antidote to pride, therefore, is not public humiliation, but inner realignment. The ancients called this returning to the level. When someone allowed pride to dominate, their soul rose artificially. Humility brought that soul back to the correct point, where it could see, hear, and decide with clarity. It was a return to reality. This concept has impressive power for today. In modern life, humility means recognizing that we don't have control over everything. It means being willing to learn, admit limitations, seek help, and adjust course. Humble people don't get caught up in their own illusions. They live lightly and honestly. When the Bible says that God exalts the humble, it's not about status, but about balance. Humility puts a person on the right track in life, and that's what pride destroys. The Bible repeatedly states that pride goes before destruction, and this is not only a spiritual warning, but an accurate description of human behavior. The ancients observed that the proud always rose too quickly and therefore lost their balance. This pattern repeats itself to this day. When someone relies solely on their own strength, sooner or later they wear themselves out. Pride creates an illusion of invincibility that always shatters in reality. A little discussed biblical curiosity is that pride was associated with blindness, not physical blindness, but distorted perception. Ancient texts describe the proud person as someone who does not see the danger ahead, because pride dulls discernment. This is why people with arrogant attitudes make impulsive decisions, ignore clear signs, and get involved in unnecessary conflicts. Pride alters vision, and wrong vision leads to wrong paths. In relationships, pride causes silent destruction. It prevents apologies, sabotages reconciliations, and fuels pointless disputes. In Jesus' time, this was seen as one of the greatest human flaws, not a lack of love, but an inability to yield. The rabbis taught that the house of the proud collapses from within because no one can live with someone who never admits fault. Pride hardens the heart to the point of isolation. At work, arrogance manifests as excessive self-sufficiency. The person doesn't delegate, doesn't listen, and doesn't learn, and this has direct consequences: stress, accumulated errors, bad decisions, and emotional exhaustion. It's the same pattern observed in the Bible. The arrogant fall because they don't accept guidance. Arrogance produces a noisy, disorganized, and burdensome life, always demanding more effort than necessary to maintain the appearance of control. Spiritually, pride is even more devastating. It closes the heart to God, to change, and to revelation. Not because God withdraws, but because the person becomes enclosed within themselves. Just as in antiquity, pride continues to create an inner abyss. The more someone relies on their own ego, the emptier they feel. Ruin is not a punishment, it is an inevitable collapse. Pride promises greatness but only delivers loneliness and confusion. In the biblical world, recognizing pride was considered an act of great wisdom. The psalmists asked God to search the heart because they knew that pride grows almost imperceptibly. Pride rarely appears as explicit arrogance. It begins with small thoughts of self-sufficiency. Therefore, the ancients encouraged practices of self-examination, understanding that no one is entirely immune to this flaw. An important point of interest is that, in ancient Judaism, there were specific prayers asking God to reveal hidden areas of the heart. They believed that pride creates blind spots and therefore a person needs help to see them. This view remains valid today. Arrogance is difficult to detect because it disguises itself as confidence, maturity, and strength. Often it grows in the areas that a person refuses to question. Modern signs of pride appear in simple attitudes: difficulty admitting mistakes, resistance to advice, irritation when someone points out a weakness, or the need to always have the last word. These are common behaviors, but they carry a worrying root. They show that the person is more concerned with protecting their own ego than with growing. And this is exactly the process that, biblically, leads to a fall. Another clear indicator is constant comparison. In Jesus' time, this comparison between religious groups generated internal conflicts and divisions. Today, it appears on social media, in the workplace, and even at home. The feeling of "I'm better" or "I deserve more" doesn't seem serious, but it reveals a misaligned heart. Pride always transforms life into competition, and where there is competition, there is wear and tear. Recognizing pride is an act of courage. It requires looking inward without fear of what you will find. The Bible shows that true strength lies not in defending oneself, but in admitting that there are areas that need adjustment. When a person identifies these signs, they begin to regain clarity. And it is this clarity that paves the way for restoration, for healthier relationships, and for a lighter spiritual life. In the biblical context, the cure for pride didn't begin with shame, but with recognition. The ancients believed that God doesn't reject a broken heart. He rejects a closed heart. Therefore, the first step was always to come down, a Jewish metaphor for returning to reality. When someone recognized that they had artificially elevated themselves, they had already taken the first step toward regaining balance. Healing begins where illusion ends. A little-known fact is that, among the Jews, being exalted by God meant being placed in the right place, not gaining status. God exalted the humble because the humble fit the purpose. Pride displaces human beings, pushing them down paths they were not prepared to follow. Humility returns a person to safe ground where decisions are clear and the heart remains stable. This return was seen as spiritual healing. Jesus reinforces this pattern directly. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. This teaching is not about punishment, but about order. The proud person rises on their own, but lacks the emotional structure to remain there. The humble person, however, allows God to guide their steps and therefore does not crumble. The biblical path to healing is allowing God to regulate the heights of life. This control should never reside in the ego. In modern practice, healing pride means ceasing to fight against limitations. It means accepting help, listening to advice, and admitting mistakes without feeling destroyed by them. Every time someone practices true humility, they rebuild a part of the soul that pride has distorted. Relationships become lighter, work becomes more intelligent, and spiritual life becomes deeper. It's an ongoing process because the ego always tries to reclaim the center. Healing from pride doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with simple choices. Reading the Bible with an open heart, seeking wisdom instead of validation, and practicing discreet acts of humility in daily life. The Bible shows that God raises up those who are willing to learn and acknowledge their dependence. Pride destroys, but humility rebuilds. And when someone begins this path, life begins to realign itself. Pride, at its core, is not just a behavior, but a distortion of perspective. It causes human beings to lose their balance, see life from the wrong angle, and carry burdens they weren't meant to carry. The Bible shows that this movement always leads to a fall because it breaks the alignment between heart, purpose, and truth. The root of the problem is not in the visible act, but in the inner space where the ego occupies the place of God. Throughout history, wise people have understood that pride is treacherous because it thrives in silence. It disguises itself as self-confidence, strength, and even mature spirituality. But by the time a person realizes it, they are already walking on fragile foundations. Therefore, the antidote has always been humility, not a weak posture, but a clear conscience. Humility restores clarity, reorganizes emotions, and opens space for God to guide history. The truth is that we have all at some point unknowingly carried seeds of pride within us. But the good news is that the Bible doesn't expose pride to destroy it, but rather to heal it. When someone recognizes that they are living beyond their means, they begin to regain stability. The heart calms down, the mind aligns, and decisions become more intelligent. The fall is avoided because the ground becomes firm again. This is just the first chapter in our series, and it's crucial because pride is the root of the other deadly sins. If this root isn't addressed, all other behaviors become distorted. Therefore, continuing to follow this series is more than just learning biblical trivia. It's about understanding how these spiritual patterns still shape modern life. Knowledge that brings clarity, prevention, and real transformation. If this content resonated with you, I urge you to follow the channel. It's not about numbers, it's because this series was built to deliver something rare. Profound biblical explanations that connect history, culture, and practical life. Something almost no one does. Following the channel ensures you don't miss the next episodes, which will delve even deeper into this path of understanding and healing. The journey continues, and I want you with me in the next chapter.